It's a privilege to be here in this space, given what has happened in this space and the import. This is an institution, and I mean literally an institution. And it's also a privilege to be doing this with Robin Carhart-Harris, who is a visionary scientist in my estimation. So I'm honored that he would be willing to chair the evening. What I'm going to do to start is just talk to you for 20 minutes or so on how I came to write this book and tell you a little bit about it. And then Robin and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. So please give some thought to what you'd like to ask us. So this was a bit of a departure for me, writing about psychedelics. I had, as Robin said, the last couple books had been about food, and apart from mushrooms, there's not a lot of overlap. But there is some continuity in my thinking. And that if you go back a few books, I've always been interested in how we use nature and how in turn nature uses us. Whether we're talking about the potato or the apple or cannabis, there's a set of species that get ahead in evolution by gratifying our desires. And our desires some of them are very straightforward and obvious, like nourishment, beauty, sweetness. But then there's this other very odd and seemingly maladaptive desire to change consciousness. Every society on Earth that we've looked at, with one notable exception, has used a plant or a fungus to change consciousness. Most of you used a plant to change consciousness today. If you had a cup of tea or coffee or chocolate or a cigarette, you are among the consciousness changers who use plants. The exception to the rule are the Inuit, the Eskimos, and it's just because nothing good grows where they live. As soon as they move to Canada, they get with the program. So I've always been curious about this desire, and some consciousness changes makes sense, like pain relief, right? We use plants to relieve pain, the opium, for example, and boredom. That's another common use. But then you've got these really radical consciousness-changing plants like psilocybin mushrooms, like peyote cactus, and there's a whole set of them. And it turns out they've been used for thousands of years. This is not a new thing. The word psychedelic has a lot of 60s. Many of us think that it started in the 60s. And indeed, our image of psychedelics was kind of was ossified in the 60s. But in fact, they have a much older, deeper history. They have an ancient history. They've been used in civilizations as different from one another as the ancient Greeks to the Mazatec Indians in Mexico and other tribes in Central America. The Aztecs used mushrooms. The South Americans, we don't know for how long, have been using ayahuasca. This is something that's been happening for a long time. And it also has a more recent history that we're equally unaware of, which is the fact that in the 50s, there was a very fertile period of research using LSD, which had recently been invented, and psilocybin, which came to the attention of the West in 1957. In fact, the word psychedelic is a artifact of the 50s, not the 60s. It means simply mind manifesting. And it was coined by an English psychiatrist working in Saskatchewan in a correspondence with Aldous Huxley, and they were kind of competing for what would be a good word to call these drugs, because they were just learning what they were good for. And actually, it was the psychiatrist, not the writer, who won. So that was interesting. So psychedelic simply means mind manifesting. So even though I've been writing about food, my interests go back further. And then I started hearing about this incredible research that was going on. First in 2006, somebody sent me a paper. And I've got the title of it here on this piece of paper, because it was such a weird paper that it caught my attention. It came out of a lab at Johns Hopkins, a scientist named Roland Griffith, who, along with Robin, is one of the pioneers of this research. And it was You can see why this caught my attention as science-minded people. Psilocybin can occasion mystical-type experiences having substantial and sustained personal meaning and spiritual significance. These are words you don't see in too many scientific papers. These studies were bringing us to this interesting frontier of scientific investigation of spiritual experience. And so I kind of put that data point in my files. And then a couple years later, I read about another study giving psilocybin to cancer patients. These were people who had, in many cases, terminal diagnoses. They were really debilitated as much by their fear, depression, and anxiety as by their cancer. And in this trial, they were having a single guided psychedelic experience. There was a placebo also, a placebo experience. And I should explain what that is, because the way that psychedelics are being used now in university trials is not the way you perhaps have heard of some people using them. It's not taking a handful of mushrooms and eating them and going to a concert. These are highly controlled, prepared. There are usually two therapists who are with you the whole time. They prepare you in advance. They tell you what to expect and how to deal with the challenging parts of the voyage. Basically, the overall advice is to surrender in and through, and not to resist when you feel yourself going crazy or you're dying or your ego is dissolving. If you fight that, you'll be pretty unhappy and anxious. And so then during the experience, they're with you the whole time, and you're wearing eye shades to encourage an internal voyage. You're listening to music, which actually has a very profound effect on the experience. And they're there, they don't say very much, the guides, but they're there to hold a hand if you're feeling upset or get you to the bathroom or something like that. And then afterwards, the guides help you, usually the next day you come back and they help you make sense of the experience, which can be very hard to understand, and help you apply whatever lessons are learned to your life. So this is the kind of experience that I'm describing, and Robin is too, when we talk about these psychedelic sessions. There's a strong therapeutic component. It's not just a drug therapy, and it departs from drug therapy in lots of ways. So I started interviewing people, because this seems so implausible to me that a psilocybin trip would actually help you with your fear of death. It was the last thing I would do if I had a terminal diagnosis. To give up that much control over your mind, and it sounds like you'd end up in a very dark place. But the patients I started talking to had amazing stories to tell. I interviewed probably a dozen of them. And I'll give you an example of one of them, because this one is kind of succinct, and I don't want to go on too long. But there was a woman I met named Dinah Baser, who was 60-ish. She was a New Yorker. She was a figure skating instructor, actually, in Manhattan. And she had ovarian cancer. And her cancer had been treated successfully. It was in remission. But she was debilitated by the fear it would come back. And she just could not get through the day. It was all she could think about. She was in this obsessive, ruminative loop. So she heard about this trial. She'd never used psychedelics. Entered and had a very profound experience. Like a lot of the cancer patients, she went into her body imaginatively and confronted, many of them confront their cancer and see it, go in and see it. In her case, though, she saw a black mass, and it was under her rib cage. So she knew it wasn't her cancer. It was in the wrong place. But she immediately recognized what it was. It was her fear. The black mass was her fear. And she, as soon as she realized that and saw it, she said she screams out. And imagine her guides who don't know what's going on in her head. And suddenly this rather timid woman screams, "Get the fuck out of my body!" and the black mass evaporates, just like that. She went on to have a very profound experience that you might describe as a mystical type experience. And she said, she's an atheist. She told me this before at the beginning of the interview. But she said she had an experience of being bathed in God's love. And I said, but you're an atheist. And are you still an atheist? She says, yes, I'm still an atheist. So why would you use that language? And she said, well, we don't have any word big enough for how it felt, this bath of love in which she found herself. So talking to people like that, you can't help but get very curious about this experience. And I, for one, felt that I could not write a book about this without having my own psychedelic experiences. I was very new to that. I hadn't really had the requisite college LSD experiences. But I had gotten very curious, and I felt obligated as a journalist to my readers to have these experiences. I am an immersion journalist. When I wrote about the cattle industry, I bought a cow. And when I wrote about architecture, I built a house. But I was also, to be honest, envious of the people I was talking to, that they had had these transformative experiences, that they'd had spiritual experiences. And I don't think I'd ever had a spiritual. I'm not a very spiritual person. And I was jealous. And I was curious to know what would that be for me. So in the end, that became part of the book. It's not the whole of the book. I need to very briefly tell you the structure of the book. I look at, as I often like to do, I look at subjects through multiple different lenses. I feel that looking at something only through the scientific lens is too limiting. There are times when the poets get there first, and that it's when you multiply perspectives, and for me that means, in this case, natural history. There's a whole chapter on the natural history of the mushroom. Social history about the what happened in the 60s with psychedelics, the backlash, and the history of the science. The neuroscience, case studies, my own experience. There's kind of a long travelogue section where I talk about my own trips. And I find by multiplying those different lenses is where you really get a full picture. So that's kind of my method in this book. And I think I'm going to leave it there, and we can pick up on, go into a little more detail with Robin. But if you'll come up, we'll begin our dialogue.
Thanks, Michael. I've just got to the end of the travelogue section,
yeah.
Actually.
But I can't believe you haven't read Neuroscience yet.
No,
I think you'd go there first.
Well, to be honest, I did. I checked that. I checked that the details were on track.
I'm relieved. Can I pour you some water?
Yes, please. Yeah, and indeed they are. In fact, it's remarkable how Michael's digested the neuroscience that isn't simple.
No, not at all.
Reported it so well. In fact, so well that it's given me plenty of added food for thought and new ideas, new hypotheses. That's something I wanted to ask about, actually, in relation to the way you grasped the intersection of how psychedelics seem to work on the brain based on, it has to be said, the limited work that's been done. I mean, we've done a few studies at Imperial, looking at different psychedelics. There's, of course, the Zurich team, Jordi Riba in Barcelona, Brazilian team looking at ayahuasca. But that's pretty much it. So it is quite limited, and we're just scratching the surface and picking up a few principles. But that said, you did manage to, I think, realize something important about what psychedelics might tell us more fundamentally about how the brain works. And particularly, I'm thinking about the Bayesian brain hypothesis, which is arguably the leading model for how the brain works, we can say. The idea that our experience of the world, including our experience of ourselves, is to a large extent based on internal models. That we sample the world, but we don't sample it and then experience it in a kind of direct way. Most of what we experience is actually experienced through our predictions, through our hypotheses and our beliefs. I thought it was great that you played with the hollow mask illusion.
Oh, yeah.
On one of your experiences. Was that was a psilocybin experience, wasn't it?
Yes. I should explain what this is. So during what turned out to be my most profound experience, it was a high-dose psilocybin experience where I couldn't enter the trials for various reasons. They weren't studying healthy normals. that I flattered myself that was my category. But they were looking for alcoholics and depressives and people with 10,000 hours of meditation. I didn't fit any of these categories. So I had to go underground to have my experiences. And I found there is a community of guides who are, most of them are trained therapists, some of them are actually MDs, serious professional people who are working underground completely illegally, guiding people in psychedelic journeys. And I found my way into this community, and I found a woman on the East Coast who I call Mary in the book, who was willing to essentially assimilate to the extent we could what you guys were doing, and a similar dose, although I was eating actual mushrooms, not using the synthetic psilocybin that's used in the trials. And I had just learned about this predictive brain phenomenon, and one of the tests of it is a very interesting thing called what's the official name of it?
Hollow mask.
Hollow mask?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's the classic mask that's used in the drama symbol and stuff, and it's concave on one side, convex on the other, and it's on a turntable, although it's now computer simulated. And as this mask goes around, first you see it normally, and then the back reveals itself, and you start seeing that it's concave, but before it can barely get all the way around, it pops out. And you think it's happening in the image, but it's in your head. Your brain is saying faces are always convex. So your brain insists on lying to you about what it's seeing. And this will work reliably. You can find this online. And I had heard from Torsten Passy, actually, that people on psychedelics, the pop-out doesn't work, that handshake between reality and the predictions breaks down. It also apparently, and there is much more literature on this, it doesn't work with schizophrenics.
Yep.
It doesn't pop out for them. So I brought it to my session thinking I would conduct a few experiments. I had it queued up and my guide was like, I don't know if you want to bring this computer into the experience because set and setting are so important. Yeah. But I was intent on doing a little science. Very little science. And so I looked at it one time early in the trip, and nothing happened. It just same. And then I looked at it when I was at the sort of peak of the experience, and the whole thing just melted. So it was a failed experiment. But somebody who has more method, more rigor could perhaps do it. I do think, though, that I'm a non-scientist here, talking to all you. Many of you are scientists. That when we're talking about consciousness, I actually think there is a role for the writer and the storyteller, because science can't really penetrate consciousness, only to a certain point, and tell us what's going on. What is the subjective feeling of being alive or having any kind of experience? So the scientists rely on the reports of their volunteers, and they try to correlate the phenomenology, as it's called, with whatever's going in the brain. And your lab has done some of that quite brilliantly with the fMRI imaging of people undergoing psilocybin.
I think, phenomenology is that other side of the coin that as psychologists, that's part of our job, and as neuroscientists, it should be part of our job that we be able to articulate what people experience, but also break it down in a way where we can measure it, but not reduce it to a level where it becomes sort of unsatisfactory and somehow depleted. And that's one of the real challenges with this work, is to allow these two sides of the coin to sit. And sometimes the neuroscientists are accused of this reductionism, this effort to try and explain away these profound transformative experiences that people can have. And at least personally speaking, I don't feel that motivation. It's a position that's referred to as dual aspect monism, that you appreciate that the experience has an intimate relationship with the brain. That's essentially the substrate that processes it. But there's also a feeling component, which is equally as valuable, and that's so some of these challenges around bringing bringing these experiences into the lab. You talked about the hollow mask and how the intention to bring this paradigm into this context and run it like an experiment just fell apart because the object of investigation fell apart, and so you just can't do your usual science in that.
No,
context.
I think doing science while you're tripping is not really workable.
And yet we need to, and it is one of these real challenges, that how do you sample the experience and then make these mappings, and are you limited only to being able to do it in retrospect? In some ways, yes, that's the way things work. You need the experience and then a report. Maybe we could have the reports more regularly in time so that we can make mappings there. But something I've realized in working on the neuroscience of the psychedelic experience is that it's made me realize that I do have to have a philosophical position. In the past, I thought, philosophy is for other people, and I'm pragmatic, I just want to get on and measure. But then you realize that you do have an approach, and you have to think very carefully about your approach. When I brought up the Bayesian brain, I do want to just slightly unpack it briefly, because I do think it's important, and you do approach it, and we had a conversation where this question was asked. So it's a handshake between data, incoming sensory information. We could think of visual input, for example, and then the models that we house in our heads that to some extent are maybe innate, but to a large extent are also developed.
Learned.
As we sample the world, they're learnt and they're revised. But the interesting thing about this model is that the handshake has an oversized hand on the side of the
Which
models.
side is that? The models,
Yeah,
right?
the
not
models. The models
sensory
have
data.
the bigger hand.
Right.
And this is the curious thing, and you see evidence for this in the likes of the hollow mask and other perceptual illusions, where instead of favoring the data, you favor the model, and you see the illusion. And that's how the brain works. And
the implications of that are really profound. I mean, that you are basically, as one neuroscientist said, that your experience of real life is a controlled hallucination.
Yeah.
In other words, you are bringing these models and you're correcting it with data, but the gist of it is imagined.
Yeah. And then this model is so appealing because it works on so many levels, perceptual, but beliefs and predictions can extend all the way up to the highest level, arguably, which is a belief that we have a absolute sense of self. And that runs core in your book, this experience and endlessly fascinating phenomenon of ego dissolution, and it's something that you experienced.
Yeah, and I guess it would be really useful if I describe one of these trips in a little more detail, and then perhaps you could offer, if you were sitting for this trip and conducting the integration after, what would you have to tell me? So the trip where I brought the computer into the room, it turns out the computer had a big influence on the trip. And I said earlier that set and setting these are terms that Timothy Leary actually devised, but he didn't invent the idea, that the internal environment and the external environment has a very powerful effect on the experience. Your expectations matter enormously. And so at the beginning of this trip, I ate this giant mushroom, and there was a little ceremony, and she put on a piece of music that I really hated, by a guy named Thierry David, who I later learned had been thrice nominated in the category of Best Chill Groove Album. Note, he was only nominated. And it was very new age. It's the kind of music that'd be fine if you were getting a really good massage in a spa, but it's for a profound psychological experience. It was just so trivial, but it sounded like electronica to me. And as can happen, the sounds generate what you see. It's synesthesia. Your senses are getting cross-wired in a very interesting way. So every note was generating another kind of bump in this landscape. It's like a stalactite and stalagmite, black, foam. And it looked a lot like what you might see in a recording studio, that soundproofing material. And the world was all this. And it was unrelenting and black, and I really hated it. And I asked her to change the music, but it stuck. And this computer imagery, which I realize now was generated by the computer animation of the mask experiment, kind of contaminated the trip for a very long time. At a certain point, it wasn't a scary place, it just wasn't where I wanted to be. And at a certain point, I had this rising anxiety. I was like, this could really get bad. I could be like trapped here forever. And so I decided I needed a little break. I also had to pee. And so I took my mask off, and I wanted to really make sure that reality was still existing. And I was gratified to see that there it was. There were, windows and furniture and doors and walls. It was like, great. But it was different. Everything was jeweled with light. And every beam of light was like directed right at me. And so Mary, my guide, helped me. She took me by the elbow and walked me across the room to the bathroom. And when I got in there, the one thing I knew, I was not going to look in the mirror. I just didn't want to. I don't know what I would have seen, but I didn't want to look in the mirror. And so I produced a spectacular crop of diamonds. And then went back to the futon or mattress I was on. And Mary at this point asked me if I wanted a booster dose. I wasn't really up to the clinical dose of approximately 4 grams of mushrooms. And I said yes. And she was kneeling down next to me, and she had been transformed. Mary had turned into, who is blonde. She has got like blonde hair parted in the middle. She's very attractive. She's got high cheekbones. She'd been turned into a Mexican Indian, and she was very dark. She had black hair. She was old, and her face was very weathered, like she'd worked outside. And I knew who it was. It was Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina is a very important person in the history of psilocybin. She was a healer in Mexico who in 1955 gave the first Westerner magic mushrooms in a ceremony. She was a curandera. Before then, no one in the West knew that these mushroom cults had survived since the Spanish conquest, underground for 500 years. The Spanish crushed them and thought they'd eliminated them, but they went on underground. So Maria Sabina had given this man, Gordon Wasson, who's actually a banker from New York, an amateur mycologist, the first psilocybin trip. So there she was, and I didn't know whether I should tell her what had happened to her, but I decided not to. And I went back under, I put on my eye shades, and then something kind of amazing happened. I saw myself burst into a cloud of little Post-it notes. And I say I saw myself, and I don't have a proper pronoun, first-person pronoun to explain what happened. I divided, and there was myself, and I was just paper blowing in the wind, but I had no desire to gather myself back together and pile it back into my accustomed self. And then I looked out again, and I saw myself completely distributed over the landscape, and I had become like a coat of paint. And that was me. And I was no more. I was just this coat of paint. And I was, but this other consciousness that gave me the vantage from which I was seeing this was totally unperturbed by this. I was fine with it. And it was this kind of objective, disinterested, unburdened point of view that I'd never experienced before. And I had separated from my sense of self, from my ego. And I went on, and there was another moment. Finally, we got the music right. And I asked her to put on some classical music, and she had this unaccompanied Bach cello suite, number 2 in D minor, if you've never heard it. It's like the saddest, most beautiful piece of music. Have you heard it?
It's absolutely beautiful. And I discovered that piece of music through a documentary on psychedelics, Hoffman's Potion.
Oh, they use it.
It runs throughout, and I just thought, this music's so powerful.
It's mournful.
Yeah.
It's about death, I think. That's how it sounded to me.
Bach experienced a lot of it. He lost children, and so there's real deep mystery.
So I first heard it at several funerals, actually, over the course of a couple of years. And I merged with this piece of music. To say I heard it would not do justice to this experience. I became one with it. I was like inside the well of the cello, and I could feel Yo-Yo Ma's, the horsehair of his bow, surfing over the strings. And this piece of music, this wasn't an ecstatic, happy experience because it was so sad. It was all about death. But it was so beautiful too, and I was so objective, I don't know what other word to use, that it reconciled me to death in that moment. I was lifted beyond all suffering and regret. It was the most incredible experience. And so, Doctor.
How'd you explain that? Well, I mean, part of why I've been enjoying this so much is that, I was drawn to this area because of a deep fascination in human experience. And it's that I have been enjoying so much. In a way, some of the neuroscience that I do can be a distraction from that. In a way, it's a thing.
I would disagree with that. I think it really informed that experience for me.
Yes. Okay.
In a good way.
Yeah, it does make you reflect on
it gave me
experience
tools.
as well.
It gave me tools to understand what was happening.
I suppose in a way where you can use work as a distraction rather than to, reflect perhaps on one's own psychology. I don't know. But this was one of the pieces, and I've opened it up while you were describing it because this was one of the pieces that moved me so much because I knew the piece and it had affected me. And then to hear you describing it was really special. And I mean, I think I probably... Would it be terrible if I asked you to read it?
No, I'd be happy to.
Okay, well, I mean, I've opened it here, and I think possibly the start of that paragraph is just so powerful, perhaps, to this bit.
To the end?
Yeah.
Though listen doesn't begin to describe what transpired between me and the vibrations of air set in motion by the 4 strings of that cello, never before has a piece of music pierced me as deeply as this one did now. Though even to call it music is to diminish what now began to flow, which was nothing less than the stream of human consciousness, something in which one might glean the very meaning of life, and if you could bear it, read life's last chapter. A question formed: why don't we play music like this at births as well as funerals? And the answer came immediately. There is too much life already lived in this piece and poignancy for the passing of time that no birth, no beginning could possibly withstand it. It was...
it's beautiful.
There's
so many examples of that. Too much life lived in this piece. And then you close this section saying, I felt as though I'd passed beyond the reach of suffering and regret, that there'd been some kind of a resolution, that you passed through the pain, and that was quite something.
And I think it gave me some insight into what the cancer patients who responded well to this had, that they had achieved that kind of egoless consciousness, which I don't know what it was. I mean, Aldous Huxley would say it was the mind at large, that it was some kind of shared universal consciousness. I don't go there. I find it very hard to believe that consciousness might exist outside our brains. I still think consciousness is produced by the brain, but I think there are many different consciousnesses produced by the same brain. But this particular one would be very comforting, I think, because it's not the sense of self that the ego is, that's really bound by your body and has a very narrow sense of self-interest. Our egos defend us. They do a lot of good things. They got the book written. They get the science done. But they're also, harsh rulers, and they can they drive our perfectionism. They there's so much regret and worry. That is all that voice, that chattering voice in your head, and it's an isolating voice. It tends. It's our defenses really patrol the boundaries between us and other people, us and nature, us and our deep emotions and subconscious. And to have that relax, and then to realize you don't die when that happens, that there is another, you're not identical to your ego, I guess. To put it simply. Yeah. And that's a very powerful thing to learn.
Yeah. And I love how you address that, and you address it in the toad experience, 5-methoxy DMT. and this notion of pure being. And I'll get to the problem of mysticism, because there
Okay,
might be
good.
some in the audience who are thinking, what about the science? Too much ego dissolution, and that's not science, and that kind of thing. But of course it is, and that's the unique opportunity of
Well, the self is the biggest model of all, right?
Absolutely.
And to take that model apart has profound effects for healing, I think.
Yeah. And you described the ego as the great doer. And yet, on 5-methoxy-DMT, there was a reminder of being, and there being a difference between being and doing. The ego, the great doer, and if that is moved out of the way or obliterated on 5-methoxy, one can just be, as terrifying as that sounded, actually.
Yeah, I mean, they're very Buddhist insights in a way. I was amazed at how often, I don't know Buddhism that well, but how often ideas that have been around for thousands of years, I mean, Buddhism does have a pretty well-developed psychology.
Yes.
And how often, I mean, speaking of the different discourses that I like to layer in my work, Buddhism got to this understanding of the self a long time ago. And so when I had my integration with my guide about that experience, I told her what had happened, and she said, that I had found there was another ground on which to stand besides ego consciousness. And she said, well, isn't that worth the price of admission? And I said, yeah, but it's over now. My ego is back in uniform, on patrol. So what good was that? And she said something interesting. She said, well, now that you've had a taste of that other way to be, to respond, you can cultivate it. And I think in terms of what endures from the experience, which is a big question, I think, and how it endures, perhaps it's a learning that by repeating it or reliving it in some ways, you could reinforce whatever that circuit was that allowed me to have that consciousness. But I asked her, so how? How do you cultivate it? And she suggested meditation, actually. Yeah. And of course, this is what really experienced meditators learn how to do: quiet the voice of the self and find this much more objective, universal feeling kind of consciousness. And so that's what I've been doing. I mean, I started meditating, and I find that I can sometimes achieve that same state of consciousness, not reliably. And I know you're not supposed to try in meditation, but I do. So it was something valuable that I learned, and it gave me a kind of distance on the ego that I might have gotten in 10 or 20 years of psychotherapy, but I got it in an afternoon.
I want to ask about that curious paradox of, we hear about, and it's very evident in your accounts of your experiences, the advantageous aspect of having one of these profound experiences, however, whatever terms we use to describe it in terms of spiritual, mystical. And something that I've just been reflecting on recently is, and it's something that you touch on towards the end of the travelogue, that does it matter? Does it matter if we refer to this as mystical, or if we invoke the notion of God? And I part of me felt slightly dissatisfied because I thought, I still think it does, because if it's about this world and nature, then isn't that a huge opportunity for a kind of naturalism process? That these experiences that are arguably at the core of religion, and they're what are referred to when people talk about the mystical and spiritual experience. They're of this world. That the brain is a thing of nature. Isn't that a huge opportunity to, in a way, bring these phenomena into the crucible of science?
Well, it's interesting that some people want to take it somewhere else. One of the interesting findings, having done this kind of cross-cultural reporting, I mean, talking to you, your volunteers, other people in your lab, and then doing it in America. In America, many more volunteers speak about mystical experience. to some extent, I think they're primed by the researchers who come at this with a more spiritual orientation, and American culture, which is more religious than English culture. I think we can make that generalization. And there's much more interest in spiritual paths of all kinds. And you in your lab, the language of ego dissolution is used a lot more often to describe what I think is the same thing.
Yeah, it is.
I think we're really talking about vocabulary, because if you have the experience of your ego dissolving, the next thing that happens is you merge with other entities. And that can be the ecstatic feeling of the mystical experience, the oceanic feeling, the idea that you're not bound by your ego and you're part of this larger entity, whether it's your family, your community, the universe, the divine, whatever it is. And everything that William James listed as the criteria for the mystical experience, which he wrote about in Varieties of Religious Experience, can be explained, I think, in terms of ego dissolution.
Yeah.
So I'm more comfortable with that vocabulary, but I totally respect the other vocabulary too. My understanding of what spiritual means changed in the course of this project. I had never understood spirituality, I realized. I'm kind of spiritually retarded. And I had always assumed that spiritual is a synonym for supernatural.
Yeah.
And that to be spiritual is to give up on the laws of science and the laws of nature. Yeah. And that there's something that transcends those laws. And my experiences, which were spiritual experiences, weren't like that. And I realized at least for me, this isn't true for everybody, the real antonym or opposite of spiritual is not material, it's egotistical. And when we silence our ego, or when the molecules help us to silence our ego, and we feel that sense of connection, because I think spiritual experience is deep, powerful connection based on love, usually, but other things too, with something larger than ourselves. And it could be nature. For me, there's a lot of talk about connecting to plants, which is, a particular interest of mine. To me, that naturalizes spiritual experience.
Oh, I think, when it's talked through like that, you realize how, essentially, we're on the same page.
Oh, I think we are, yeah.
Yeah, and, notions of God do not necessarily, and the experience of God doesn't necessarily need to be anything supernatural. It has a psychological reality. It can be experienced, therefore it's real. And it's not a delusion, in the sense of a unitive experience, the core of a spiritual experience. Yeah. These are things that are, that we see all the time in the lab when we give high doses. And so I think that's such an exciting opportunity.
And people can interpret it different ways, though, also. Some people have that experience, and their interpretive frame says that's God, that's something, that's a universal consciousness. But other people go somewhere else. I was really struck by something Carlo Rovelli said in the pages of The Guardian. This is a Italian physicist who wrote 7 Brief Lessons on Physics and has a recent book about time. And he said he'd gotten, one of the things that turned him on to physics was a LSD trip he had when he was 17. And why? Well, he'd had a new understanding of time. One of the things that happens pretty reliably on a psychedelic trip is your sense of past, present, and future can merge, or the present just opens up and it becomes eternal. And he had such an experience of time. And then after he was straight again, he started asking himself, well, what was the delusion, or what was the illusion? How does he know that his everyday normal waking consciousness concept of time is more real than the concept he had on LSD? And in fact, the LSD concept of time aligns much more neatly with the laws of physics as we understand them, and the fundamental weirdness of theoretical physics right now, where time, the way we experience time is not the way time is. I mean, time is much more like space, and in the laws of physics, going forward or backward doesn't really make a big difference. But of course, it makes all the difference to us. And so for him, the psychedelic experience opened up a beyond that is grounded in physics. And for someone else, it could open a beyond that's grounded in religion. And I thought that was really interesting, that these ideas are, there's a fundamental experience, and then there's the interpretation you lay on it.
Yeah, the narrative that we can build, because
Yeah.
of course, religions have run wild with that and created these narratives that then take over from the core experience itself, perhaps.
Yeah.
Conscious of time, because we'll open it up to the audience in 7 minutes, and so the last, too large a theme to try and address in 7 minutes is the theme of the crossover that's happening right now. Thanks to your book, to a large extent, and we're living it right now. And this wonder of what will it be like? Mistakes were made in the '60s. Timothy Leary became an evangelist, and all sorts of other mistakes were being made. How can we do this properly now? And what will be the impact? And there was a section where you talk about acid dissolves, and Leary would talk about, was it LSD could stand for let the state dissolve, and this concern that if it crosses over, it is something that's not just intellectually threatening to the system, but perhaps even actively somehow in terms of changes in belief structure.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question whether what happened in the 60s could happen again.
Yeah.
And in the same way, what happened in the 60s is when the drugs entered the counterculture, they contributed substantially to the character of the counterculture, the styles, the attitudes, and I think to the generation gap, as at least we called it in the States, this unusual break between two generations, and which I think LSD did contribute to, in this sense. It gave young people a rite of passage that old people didn't understand. Normally, rites of passage knit societies together, if you talk to anthropologists about it. They're organized by the elders, and they set up these obstacles for the young to pass through, and they successfully complete it, whether it's a vision quest or a bar mitzvah, and they are then part of the adult society. Here, you had this weird, once-in-a-lifetime, I think, rite of passage called the LSD trip, where it landed the people who had it in a country of the mind that the adults just didn't understand. And it was very disruptive to society. It won't happen again because now the elders know the territory, or a lot of the elders know the territory. And I think that is one protection against the same thing happening. But these drugs can challenge authority.
Yeah.
I think that they make you rethink everything.
Yeah.
And that there is this kind of new perspective that, Timothy Leary said, he was kind of taunting the president, but he said, kids who take LSD won't fight your war and won't join your corporations. Yeah. And he wasn't entirely wrong. The question is that the way LSD was constructed then, or is it something fundamental to it? And I don't know the answer to that.
I suspect, and perhaps shouldn't say it, and colleagues would say, don't, but that it is part of the action. And when we think about, you describe it, very well in your book around the breakdown of the hierarchical organization of the brain,
right.
That the brain behaves in a anarchic way, that lower systems are allowed freer expression, and it's just easy to make that extrapolation from brain dissolution and governing systems in society.
Yeah. The challenge to hierarchies at every level.
Yeah,
yeah, that's a very interesting idea.
But then again, as you touch on in your book, the importance of integration. What do you do when you return to sobriety? How do you cultivate those lessons so that what you've picked up can be integrated and assimilated in a healthy way? And in some sense, maybe that's the challenge where we are right now, is to properly assimilate.
And get better at doing that.
Yeah.
I also think that the key is here, we haven't talked that much about healing and the therapeutic value of these experiences. And finally, that's where we are as a civilization. We have a tremendous mental health crisis on our hands. 300 million people are depressed around the world. That number's gone up 18% since 2005. Suicides, as we saw dramatically last week, are a tremendous problem, and that's getting worse too, and addiction too. And so we need tools. And I think if scientists like yourself and the other groups working on this can prove that this is a tool that can help heal people with mental illness, I think the society will embrace it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of what enthuses me right now, but also this realization that this is big right now, and major investments coming in and such like, and we've got to do it right, and just being conscious of what the pitfalls are. And so, the importance of integration, the importance of realizing that this is an experience of this world, to avoid perhaps some of the dangers of so-called spiritual bypassing, where people get lifted off the ground with ideas of transcendence and such like, but keep it earthy, keep it of this world.
I think there are a lot of pitfalls to be avoided, and one of them is the exuberance of the researchers, which is an occupational hazard. When you work with these substances, you see amazing things happen, but everybody has to stay sober, and in their work and lead with the science. And I think another big problem in the '60s was Timothy Leary. He got bored with science, or he got impatient with science. And he finally said, this works, a double-blind, crazy. There's no time for it. We have to give it to everybody. We have a civilization to heal. And I can understand that, but we don't have a model for administering a drug to a whole society. We have fluoride, at least in the United States. You have fluoride in your water? Yeah. Okay, a few people object to that, but basically that's a pretty good public health message. But I think putting LSD in the water is not as
doesn't
clear
work,
cut.
Apparently. Something to do with the chlorine.
It doesn't work.
No.
Keeping an eye on the science and leading with the science. And fundamentally, even though I had these personal experiences, it was all in an effort to illuminate the science from inside. And that we shouldn't let our enthusiasm run away with ourselves.
And you really do get a sense of that in the book, that it's very mature and conscious treatment of such a rich and fascinating topic.